Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Christian List. He is Professor of Philosophy and Political Science at the London School of Economics and is the author of Why Free Will is Real, that we're going to talk about today. So, Dr. List, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for having me on your program.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Okay, great. So let's start with this question because we're going to talk about free will. What is free will, or how do you define it? Because I would imagine that different philosophers would address this question in different ways, right?
Yeah, so I think it's probably best to just begin with a basic intuitive idea. So, this morning I had breakfast, and so did you. So I had a choice between coffee and tea. So I could have had a black tea, but as it happened, I had a double espresso. And now I feel that this choice was up to me. It seems to be true to say that I could have had a tea instead, even though I had the coffee. Now, if we think about some more substantial decisions, like which job to apply for, which university to try to attend if you are applying for university places, or whether to get married, we also think that those choices are up to us, at least to some extent. I mean, nobody denies that there are all sorts of background constraints from our own personal background, society, our means, resources, and so on and so on. But nonetheless, we do think we really have a choice in each of these cases. And so the basic idea of free will is simply that we are able to choose and control our own actions. That's sort of the central idea. And then, of course, philosophers have spelled this out in a variety of different ways, and I'm sure we get to talk about some of the nitty-gritty details.
Yeah, sure. But by the way, since you mentioned control, does it have to be conscious control, or could it be simply some sort of unconscious or subconscious control over our actions?
Well, we are already getting into a more advanced question. So at the moment, while we're still sort of talking about the notion of free will at a fairly intuitive level, I would answer your question in the affirmative. Yes, there is a sense in which conscious control is required for free will. I mean, then of course we need to discuss how exactly we are going to spell that out. But I mean, the mere fact that, let's say, my decision is controlled, let's say, solely by some subconscious physical or chemical process in my brain and body, that's not quite good enough. For an action to be attributable to my own free will, it somehow has to be the case that I, as the intentional agent, am making this decision. It's not just some underlying physical process.
I think that there's another concept in philosophy that is important for us to tackle here, that is the one of agency, because there's a tight connection between how people think about free will and how they think about agency, or what is an agent. So, I mean, what is the relationship there?
Yeah. So, agency is a central idea. Now, one key difference between us humans and physical systems that we describe as inanimate is that we are indeed goal-directed, intentional agents. Now, you can define this in a variety of ways, but a simple definition of an agent goes roughly like this. An agent is an entity or a system which forms some representations of its environment, which also has some motivations or some goal-directed states that depict what this entity would ideally like to achieve in the environment. And the entity then systematically intervenes in the environment or interacts in the environment in a way that is directed by its representational and motivational states. Now, we often call the representations the beliefs of this entity. We call the motivations the desires or preferences or intentions. Again, different ways you can make this precise. And then the intervention in the environment or interaction with the environment is basically the process of acting on the basis of the beliefs and desires. And so, we humans qualify as intentional agents in this sense. We have beliefs, desires, and the capacity to act within the environment based on these states, whereas we wouldn't normally depict, any odd physical system like this. I mean, you can have a complicated physical model of the solar system, for instance. It's a relatively complex system. You can use principles from classical mechanics or from relativity theory to describe the trajectory of the planets as they orbit around the sun. But you would never ascribe beliefs or desires or representations or motivations or the notion of goal-directed action to any of the components of that system. So the big difference between an agent and, let's say, a mere physical system is that an agent has intentionality or goal-directedness and acts on the basis of some representations of the environment, while a physical system alone is not quite like this. And of course, agency is a key prerequisite for free will. With a system that isn't an agent, you wouldn't even ask the question about whether this has free will. So I've got my water bottle here. This is undoubtedly a physical entity, but the question of whether the water bottle has free will, that doesn't even arise. It makes very little sense. On the other hand, with a system that is an agent, like you and me, human beings, paradigmatically, it is an entirely meaningful question whether this agent has free will.
Mm-hmm. In the book, at a certain point, you say that there's a distinction between free will as a capacity and free will in its exercise. I mean, how we exercise free will. So could you explain that?
Yeah, so at least conventionally, we like to think that humans do indeed have free will as a general capacity. I mean, I characterize this capacity as consisting of three subcapacities or components. First of all, we are indeed intentional agents. That's what we just discussed. Secondly, we have the ability to make choices between alternative possibilities. So sometimes we face a genuine fork in the road where we could choose one thing or another. Coffee versus tea was a very trivial example, or get married or not married. That's a more major example. And then finally, we have some form of causal control over the resulting choices. That feature is also sometimes called mental causation. So when we act, we tend to think that it is really our intentions that make a difference to the resulting actions, and not just some subconscious physical state of the brain. So this capacity of free will, in short, can be understood as consisting of intentional agency, choice between alternative possibilities, and causal control over the resulting actions or mental causation. That's the capacity. And that's, of course, a general capacity that an entity or an organism may or may not have. Now, whether we exercise this capacity at a particular moment is a separate matter. So, I mean, clearly, for instance, when you sleep, you don't exercise this capacity. Or even if, let's say, you sleep, but you have a psychological or neurological condition that makes you prone to sleepwalking, for instance. I mean, that happens to some people. And then suppose you engage in sleepwalking and you do a bunch of things while sleepwalking. We wouldn't attribute the resulting behaviors to your own free will. It's clearly a psychological or neurological phenomenon which requires an explanation, and it's a complex phenomenon. But this is not something that we would classify as the exercise of free agency. Or likewise, if you generally have the capacity of free will, but now you end up being intoxicated under the influence of alcohol, for instance, this could be so severe as to be completely agency undermining, and then you behave in very, very erratic ways. And once again, we would not then attribute the resulting behaviors to your own free will. I mean, we might attribute the decision to get drunk to your own free will. That depends on the details of the case. It might be that you freely decide to put yourself into that kind of physiological state. But once you are in the intoxicated physiological state, your agential capacities may no longer function in quite the right way.
Mm-hmm. Because free will also connects with moral questions, like, for example, attributing moral responsibility to someone, punishing people that perform some behaviors that we consider to be bad. I mean, one question is, does free will exist or not? But then another question would be, does it matter if people believe in free will or not for these kinds of more moral questions?
Yeah, so you're completely right. There is a close connection between the idea of free will and the idea of responsibility in morality and in the law. So it's very plausible to argue that having the capacity for free will is a necessary condition for being the kind of entity or agent who can be held responsible for their actions. So again, if we take my water bottle here, this is not a free agent, it's not an agent at all. And clearly the water bottle is not a candidate for responsibility ascription. And so unless there is free will, so it is conventionally thought, the entire issue of fitness to be held responsible does not even arise. Now, if you do have free will as a capacity, then it's still a complicated question whether you can be held responsible for certain actions. I mean, it might be that you have the capacity for free will, but some behavior happened while you were sleepwalking, for instance. You still have the general capacity, but somehow the behavior in question is not attributable to free will, and then this is clearly a case of no responsibility, or for sure diminished responsibility. Or it might be that you do something and you do it quite freely, and it inadvertently causes some harm, but this is due to factors that you could not reasonably have foreseen. I mean, for instance, suppose, again, I've got my water bottle. I have a very sincere and well-justified belief that this bottle does indeed contain water rather than poison. Suppose I now offer you a glass of this water, and just unbeknownst to me, through some totally unforeseeable sequence of events, someone put poison into this, and you get sick as a result of drinking this water, then this is, of course, super duper regrettable, and I'd feel very unhappy if this happened. I'd clearly be very much causally implicated in offering you this water, but I would not be held morally responsible for it because it is something that I could not reasonably have foreseen. So before we can make the jump from saying, such and such action is attributable to a person's free will, to saying that this person is to be held responsible for that action, some additional conditions like certain knowledge or information or foreseeability conditions really have to be in place. And those are complicated issues which still need to be discussed in moral philosophy. And those are also issues on which lawyers and legal theorists have very significant debates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, but if there comes a time where we definitely answer the question of free will, of the existence of free will, and scientists or philosophers conclude that it doesn't exist, should we tell people that they don't have any free will? Because since it's at the basis of how we deal with moral issues and at the basis of our legal systems, I mean, would it be good for people to think that they are not to be held responsible for their own actions because they don't have any control over them?
Yeah, so this is of course, very important question. So some people think free will is just an illusion, and then those who think that free will is just an illusion are divided into at least two different camps. One camp thinks it would actually be really useful for us as a society to learn that it is an illusion, because this would, for instance, change our attitudes towards punishment. It would make us much less judgmental and much less harsh in judging people and perhaps in punishing people. We'd no longer have a good justification for any forms of retribution. And so that camp of free will skeptics sometimes argues that this is a welcome conclusion, that free will is an illusion. Another camp would say, well, free will is indeed an illusion, but it would be unhelpful if people came to learn that it is an illusion, because this would give rise to less willingness to comply with moral norms and less responsible patterns of behavior, and the recognition that there's no such thing as free will would have all sorts of negative social consequences. Now, where do I stand in this? Well, first of all, of course, the issue doesn't exactly arise for me, because I have argued in my book, and I defend the view that free will is real and not an illusion. But let's set that aside for a second while we're discussing this illusion scenario. Secondly, I am of the firm opinion that we should not deceive people about the truth. I mean, I am a believer in coming to terms with the truth and following the truth where it leads us. I think it would be, from a perspective of scientific ethics, it would be rather unethical if the scientific community came to the honest conviction that free will is an illusion and refrained from telling people about this. I think that would be really disrespectful and undesirable. So I think if free will were an illusion, we would really have to come to terms with this. Now, what would be the downstream consequences for society? I admit they might be somewhat complicated. We would definitely have to have some serious debates about how to reconceptualize morality and how to reconceptualize some aspects of the law if we give up the assumption of free will. I think this can be done. There are some very, very good and smart philosophers who have pursued this project very seriously. I mean, for instance, Dirk Perelbaum, who's a philosopher at Cornell University, wrote a very good book, Living Without Free Will, in which he develops and discusses this kind of scenario and looks at the implications of a what is sometimes called a hard incompatibilist view about free will. So I'm not denying that there are ways of rethinking morality and the law, even against the background of the no free will scenario. So that's why I definitely do not think we should withhold that kind of information if it were to materialize from the general public, but we should deliberate what to do about it. There's a further point of agreement that I have with a number of those free will skeptics who welcome the implications for some aspects of punishment. I agree with them that many of the world's criminal justice systems, and we could discuss them one by one, but now just make a sort of general point. Many of the world's criminal justice systems are based on certain retributivist ideas. So the idea that punishment plays the role of some kind of retribution for the acts that the offender has done. And I think retributivist approaches to punishment are really undesirable. I'm much more in favor of an alternative, more reformist approach to punishment that focuses much more on notions such as reconciliation, reintegration into society, rehabilitation of offenders. So this is a much gentler approach to criminal justice than the retributivist one. And so I'd welcome a more rehabilitative criminal justice system independently of the debate about free will. I do think, however, that we don't need to reject the idea of free will in order to advocate a more humane criminal justice system. I think there are plenty of good, independent, moral and social reasons for having a humane criminal justice system and for not adhering to old-fashioned retributivist norms. We can do all of this, and we can still embrace the idea of free will.
Mm-hmm. So let's now talk about some challenges to your position. So talking about science, if we go down to the level of reality that physics deals with, like for example atoms, subatomic particles, wouldn't it ever be possible for us to describe or understand behavior at that level of description? Because I mean, couldn't it be just a matter of us being ignorant, not having enough knowledge to do that, but somewhere in the future perhaps we that could be possible?
Well, so here's what I would say. So suppose you are able to completely describe the workings of the human organism as a physical system. Mm-hmm. Maybe at the level of particle physics, or maybe if this is too ambitious, maybe at the level of at least cells within the body, or at the level of neurons or clusters of neurons in the brain, at some such relatively fine-grained micro level. So then you're looking at an extremely complex physical system. And then if you could describe this extremely complex physical system, then you might be able to describe certain physical processes within this system. You might be able to describe, how that system responds to certain incoming stimuli or physical inputs coming from the environment, and maybe then describe probability distributions over different responses that the system might take, something along those lines. You'd have an unbelievably complex story of physical micro details. But the trouble is that you'd not really be able to pick up the explanatorily salient patterns and regularities that we are normally interested in when we're trying to understand human behavior. So, I mean, think about just current affairs. There was just the U.S. election. Some people voted for Biden, others voted for Trump. Political scientists will want to explain and understand those voting behaviors, and that's actually an important research question in political psychology. Why do people vote the way they do? Can we say something systematic about the reasons that make a voter support one particular candidate or political party rather than another? Now, if we were to now look at each voter as a physical system or even a neurological system, and then were to talk about response patterns of neurons in the brain and configurations of those neural firing patterns, we would not really be able to pick up the explanatorily salient difference makers that really tell us, for instance, what at least some of those who voted for one candidate have in common, and what some of those others who voted for another candidate in common, or what exactly it was that made the difference in the case of a swing voter. We'd be lost in physical details. We wouldn't see the forest for the trees. On the other hand, if we think of those voters, not so much in physical or neuroscientific or biological terms, but we think of them in more cognitive or psychological terms. We view them as intentional goal-directed agents who have beliefs about their environment, who have a value system, who have intentions, who have goals, who engage in sophisticated planning, who respond intelligibly to their environment, and so on and so on. Then we can actually begin to make sense of their choices under this explanatory frame. And so that's why what we call the higher level explanation, in this case the psychological or the social scientific explanation, is just a superior explanation over the purely physical one. And that's not just because of our ignorance of the details of neural response patterns, but it's simply because we'd be picking up the explanatorily wrong level of detail were we to focus on the physical brain realization as opposed to the conscious cognitive psychological processes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, talking about the neuroscientific level of description, I think that in your book you also mention at a certain point that we also know that in different brains from different people we get different patterns of firing patterns of neurons, and they still produce the same kind of behavior. So, I mean, even if we have a complete description of how the brain works, if different patterns in different people produce the same behavior, then, I mean, it's a bit complicated to be able to predict their behavior since it's different patterns in different people.
Yeah, so this is a phenomenon which philosophers of mind call multiple realizability. So the idea is that mental states, for all we know, are multiply realizable at the level of the physical brain. So one and the same psychological mental state that plays a certain role in directing intentional actions may have a variety of subtly different brain realizations, certainly across different subjects, but plausibly also within the same subject. And we then want to really pick up the explanatorily relevant psychological state to explain some action, rather than the perhaps redundant details of the physical implementation, which could really vary from case to case. I mean, if you think about something like consumer theory in economics, so consumer theory gives us some general principles about how consumers typically respond to changes in supply and demand. So, for instance, they respond in a certain systematic way to price changes or to scarcity, and these are actually fairly well confirmed patterns. Of course, they're not completely perfect, but approximately they are extremely well confirmed patterns. You see them across many different economies. You see them across many different generations of consumers. You see them in traditional agricultural economies. You see them in modern economies with a lot of e-commerce as well. So these are fairly stable patterns that are quite independent of the details of the realization or implementation of the economy. And so it's a much more compact explanation than if we think of consumers as rational agents, or at least boundedly rational agents with certain objective functions and with certain beliefs and representations, who then systematically respond to this, than if we try to pinpoint the precise details of the neural firing patterns in their brains.
Yeah. In the book, you address three different challenges to your position. The first one is the challenge from radical materialism. Perhaps some of the things we've already talked about in the two previous questions will connect with these challenges, but could you explain that one, the challenge from radical materialism, first?
Yes. So, as I pointed out, I understand free will as a three-part capacity, which consists of intentional agency, choice between alternative possibilities, and causal control over the resulting actions. And these three challenges that you've mentioned are scientifically motivated challenges for each of these three purported capacities. And the challenge from radical materialism is meant to be a challenge for the claim that humans are intentional agents. So what this challenge basically says is that intentional agency is an illusion. It's a folk notion left over from a traditional pre-scientific way of thinking about humans and human behavior. And in the long term, this challenge says our understanding of humans as goal-directed intentional agents will be replaced by a more neuroscientific understanding of humans just as complicated neural or physiological systems. And then, so the challenge goes, we're going to explain human behavior at the physical, physiological, or neuroscientific level, and no longer at the psychological, cognitive, and agential level. Prominent philosophers who have defended this kind of neuroscientific challenge for the idea of intentional agency are Patricia and Paul Churchland, very, very prominent proponents of a neuroscientifically oriented approach to the philosophy of mind. I think the difficulty with this challenge is already summed up by what we just discussed a few moments ago. Namely, it's summed up by the point that our best explanations of human behavior in many, many circumstances are simply not at the neuroscientific or physical or physiological level, but they are explanations at the psychological or social scientific level. And to the extent that viewing people as intentional agents is explanatorily necessary or explanatorily indispensable, I argue that we have very good reasons to also treat intentional agency as a real phenomenon. Mm-hmm. So that, but for me, the burden of proof would lie with the proponents of that challenge. I mean, they'd really have to give us compelling evidence that we can systematically, globally understand human behavior in all its social and psychological complexity without reference to those intentional agential notions. And I think virtually everything that we know from the psychological, social, and human sciences tells us that at the very most, neuroscience can give us some useful insights into implementation mechanisms by which the brain implements certain cognitive capacities. And that's useful. I totally agree that that's useful. But that most definitely has not replaced the more intentional explanations of human behavior that we tend to give across the human and social sciences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another one of the requirements for free will that you present in the book has to do with the capacity to choose between alternative possibilities. And the challenge associated with that is the challenge from determinism, if I'm not mistaken. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, that's the most widely discussed challenge for free will, on which there is a massive philosophical literature. So determinism is the thesis that once the physical state, the complete physical state of the universe is given at a particular point in time, so let's say at the time of the Big Bang, then the laws of nature are such that the entire subsequent trajectory of physical states is uniquely determined or fixed. In other words, given the initial state of the universe at any particular point in time, in particular the first point in time, if there was a first point in time, given that state, one and only one future trajectory of physical states is possible under the laws of nature. Now, this thesis of determinism is very much associated with some tenets of an Enlightenment worldview. Newton gave us a deterministic depiction of the classical physical laws. Laplace famously came up with some thought experiments, Laplace's demon, in which the hypothesis of deterministic laws of nature played a very central role. Now, if the universe is deterministic, some of the free will skeptics say, well, then everything that was going to happen after the time of the Big Bang was kind of written into the initial conditions under the laws of nature, so that the fact that I had my coffee this morning, for instance, rather than tea, it was already predetermined well before my apparent choice, well before I even came into existence. And also the fact that we are having this conversation right now was predetermined, or your listeners' decision whether to tune in or whether to switch off at this point was already predetermined. So there are never any forks in the road at which choices are possible. So that's the challenge, and so that seems a very formidable challenge at first sight. Now, some philosophers respond to this by redefining free will, I would say watering down free will, in a way that just gives up alternative possibilities as a requirement for free will. I mean, if you were prepared to say, well, free will requires some form of intentional agency, maybe it also requires some form of mental causation, which we then need to carefully spell out, but it doesn't require alternative possibilities, well, then determinism no longer poses a challenge. However, I think that this is indeed a watered down notion of free will, which is no longer fully in line with our conventional intuitions about free will. I mean, sometimes, of course, we shouldn't take conventional intuitions as completely given on everything. Our intuitions can also confuse us, but I do think that there are really good reasons to think that that choice between alternative possibilities is a very important prerequisite of free will. So how then can we reconcile choice between alternative possibilities with the possible scenario of a deterministic universe? Now, there are, again, a variety of different strategies. My own strategy is to actually point out that the distinction between determinism and indeterminism is best understood not so much as a distinction that we draw once and for all looking at the universe simpliciter. Rather, I've convinced myself over the course of my work over the years that the distinction between determinism and indeterminism is best understood as a level-specific distinction. That is to say, for each level of description or level of analysis at which we might think about, conceptualize, explain, and understand the world, we can ask a level-specific question of whether the world is deterministic or indeterministic at that level. So if we describe the world in terms of particle physics, okay, we can then ask a well-defined question: is the world understood as a particle physics system deterministic or not? If we describe the world, or now maybe focusing on the biosphere as a biological system, we can then ask, well, is this biological system understood at that biological level a deterministic or indeterministic system? And we can keep going like this. We can ask, is a human being understood as an intentional agent with cognitive and psychological states? Is that a deterministic or indeterministic system? And these are different questions. They're related in certain ways, which can be spelled out in more detail, but they are not one and the same question. They are different questions. And the key insight, which is initially maybe a little bit counterintuitive, but for which I think there are very good technical arguments, is that determinism at one level within this within this hierarchy or network or lattice of levels, determinism at one level does not imply determinism at all other levels. Rather, determinism at one level can coexist with indeterminism at another level. This is a phenomenon which is actually not so unfamiliar, even in some branches of the natural sciences. So, for instance, there is classical mechanics and there is statistical mechanics. Classical mechanics models systems deterministically. Statistical mechanics redescribes those systems in a much more coarse-grained way, and then redescribes them in a way that at least formally looks indeterministic. I mean, how we are going to interpret this then is a sort of further question. Think about, as an illustration, think about weather forecasting. You could think of the Earth's atmosphere as a classical mechanical system with lots of air molecules that are bouncing around under some classical physical laws, and perhaps you can think of the interactions between these individual air molecules as deterministic interactions. So were you able to describe the full state of each air molecule, then you and that of the neighboring air molecules and various other environmental conditions, you might be able to then exactly calculate what this air molecule is going to do next. But that level of description is not one that meteorological science uses. Meteorologists, for very good reasons, describe the atmosphere in a more coarse-grained way. They abstract away from individual air molecules and focus on macro variables. And at that more macroscopic level of description, we understand the atmosphere as a stochastic system which no longer behaves deterministically. So here you've got indeterminism at the higher level, coexistent with determinism at the lower level. That's just an illustration of how you can have lower level, for instance, physical level determinism, and then indeterminism at some higher level. My point is that when we look at our best scientific accounts of human agency, for instance, those given to us in some sophisticated areas of psychological decision theory and other fields within the psychological, social, and human sciences, then those depict human agents as indeterministic systems in the sense that they ascribe to them the capacity for choice between alternative possibilities. So those human and social sciences, I argue, are committed to a presupposition of what I call agential indeterminism, indeterminism at the level of agency. That's a sort of explanatory presupposition that we need to make in order for these explanations of human behavior as agents to get off the ground. That kind of agential indeterminism is another example of a case of higher level indeterminism that in principle is compatible with lower level determinism. The only objection that now very often comes up is, well, maybe from a purely mathematical perspective, I'm right that a system described in a more coarse-grained way can formally look indeterministic, even if the more fine-grained underlying microphysical system might look deterministic. But surely the move from lower-level determinism to higher-level indeterminism is just a move from a state of complete information to a state of ignorance or incomplete information about the micro details. And so what we really have here is not genuine indeterminism, but just some form of unpredictability due to our ignorance of the underlying physical details. But here my response to this objection is that whenever our best scientific theories within a particular domain attribute a certain property or phenomenon to the world, and that attribution turns out to be really explanatorily indispensable, then we have very good grounds to just treat this as a real phenomenon and not just as some kind of illusion due to ignorance. I mean, you might say, just to give another analogy, solid surfaces are clearly a higher level phenomenon. I mean, if you thought about the world through the lens of quantum mechanics, then you would have Schrödinger wave functions giving us distribution functions over different spatial locations, but they wouldn't give us any such thing as sort of solid surfaces. Solid surfaces are very much an emergent phenomenon that you get at the macroscopic level of description. You wouldn't have the phenomenon of solid surfaces wouldn't be quite visible at, for instance, the level of quantum mechanics. But we wouldn't want to say the solidity of the table surface that is in front of me right now is an illusion because quantum mechanics doesn't refer to it. Rather, the solidity of this surface is a perfectly real phenomenon, albeit a higher level phenomenon. Or likewise, we think that cats and dogs are real, or we think that institutions are real, or ecosystems are real. Again, if you were to look at the world just through the lens of particle physics, those you wouldn't refer to those entities. They would somehow be invisible, but we wouldn't deny their reality and then say they're just illusions. And so in much the same way, I want to argue, well, if it really so happens that our best scientific theories of human behavior understand human beings as choice-making agents who have alternative possibilities to choose from, then we should treat the presence of those alternative possibilities as a real phenomenon, and we should then be realists about agential indeterminism and not just view it as an illusion. So I interpret agential indeterminism in what philosophers would call an ontic way rather than just an epistemic way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk about the last challenge. So another one of the requirements, the third one of free will, is the capacity to control one's own actions. And the challenge associated with that is the challenge from epiphenomenalism. Could you tell us about that?
Yes. So when I act and purportedly act freely, for instance, by forming the intention to lift this glass now, and then I act on that intention, I do lift the glass, I'd want to say that this action qualifies as my own free action, or this qualifies as an exercise of free will only if my intentional state was indeed the cause of the action. If this apparent action had been caused just by some subconscious physical brain state that is completely beyond my control, and my intention is just some kind of byproduct that floats along in my own subjective perception, then that's not good enough for free will. So that's really the idea that we require causal control or mental causation for free will. Now, this so-called challenge from epiphenomenalism basically claims that when I act, it's not my conscious mental state that is the cause of the action, but rather some subconscious physical brain state over which I have no control. And the free will skeptics who argue along those lines tend to come from two different directions here. Some skeptics would raise a relatively conceptual argument, while others would raise a more neuroscientific argument. The relatively conceptual argument is one that goes back to the philosopher Jaegwon Kim, a very influential philosopher of mind, whose work I greatly admire and have learned a lot from. He's basically come up with something called the causal exclusion argument, which says something like this. It says, well, there are two important principles that we would want to subscribe to in a scientific worldview. First of all, there is the principle of the causal closure of the physical world, or the causal closure of the physical domain. This is to say that every effect that has a physical manifestation also has a physical cause, rather than something that comes from outside, something extra physical that would go against the grain of a scientific worldview. That's the causal closure principle. And then secondly, the causal exclusion principle. Here, this basically says that when you have identified the physical effect for the physical cause for some effect, then and suppose that that's the complete and sufficient physical cause for that effect, then there isn't another altogether distinct second additional cause, maybe a non-physical or mental one, because it would somehow seem very unparsimonious to have this idea of systematic causal overdetermination. Be very, very strange to say, well, my physical brain state was the sort of complete and total sufficient cause for my action, and then simultaneously my conscious mental state was also the complete and total sufficient cause for the very same action. That'd be a very, very strange form of causal overdetermination. And so if you accept those two principles, causal closure of the physical world and the causal exclusion principle, then it would seem that we'd have to attribute the lifting of the glass here really to underlying physical causes rather than to those intentional mental causes, unless we are prepared to say that my intentional mental state is nothing but the underlying physical brain state. But that's precisely the sort of reductionistic picture that I've already argued against. So that's the sort of conceptual version of the challenge, and it's a very important and sophisticated argument on which there is deservedly a rich philosophical literature. The more neuroscientific challenge comes from these famous experiments conducted by Benjamin Libet in the early 80s, and since then other variants of these experiments have been done, replicated by others. So those experiments ask subjects to perform some spontaneous voluntary motor actions, like pressing a button at a particular point in time. The subjects then face an easily readable clock on a screen in front of them, which moves quite fast. And so the subjects get told, at any time of their choice, decide to press the button and then do it. And please remember exactly where the clock was when you made your conscious choice. And so then they remember, at this particular point in time, I made the choice to press the button. But simultaneously, the subjects are also hooked up to some brain scanner that looks at electrical activity in the brain. And they then monitor the pattern of brain activity, and they compare it with the subject's self-report of the time when they made the conscious decision to act. And it turns out, that's the striking finding of the Libet experiments, that you can see some preparatory brain activity, the so-called neural readiness potential, a little bit before the subject's self-reported time of the conscious decision to perform the action. And so Libet and others then interpreted this as showing that really the cause of the action is not so much the conscious decision, but this prior neuronal readiness potential, so the prior neural activity, and so the conscious decision is just some kind of epiphenomenon that floats along. And so once again, the conclusion is that the causes of the resulting actions are not so much conscious intentional decisions or intentional states, but underlying physical brain states. Now, what can we say in response to those arguments? Well, just to sort of cut a long story short, as far as Libet is concerned, and the Libet experiments, although the experiments are nicely designed and carefully performed, and they have been replicated, and I definitely do not take issue with the empirical findings. I think those cannot reasonably be denied. They tend to provide relatively little detail on the definition of causation. So how do we actually understand causation? I mean, what is completely undeniable is the temporal sequence that they report. There is this neural readiness potential, and there is the conscious, self-reported conscious decision followed by some action. And the neural readiness potential is undoubtedly part of the brain technology or implementation machinery that underpins this human decision-making process. I mean, all of this is completely undeniable. But there's no definition given to us here of what we actually mean by a cause. And I think if we look at not just scientific practice, but if we also look at the philosophy of science, then the perhaps most influential way to think about causation nowadays is the one that defines causes as difference makers for their effects. So causes are basically factors that make a systematic difference to the effect, where that systematic difference is being made even when you control for various other confounders and other background variables. Again, this can be made more precise, but causes are difference makers for their effects. And so when we then ask, well, what are the difference makers for human actions in general? That's now a good explanatory question for the social sciences. And we now need to ask, well, if we're looking for the difference makers of any particular person's actions, should we look at the detailed physical brain states of this person, or should we at least often look at the psychological, mental, or cognitive states that the person has? Arguably, it's really the psychological, cognitive, or mental states that are typically the most robust difference makers for the resulting actions, rather than the details of the brain state, because the brain state, if we go back to the point about multiple realizability, could have been a little bit different while still giving rise to much the same result. And so the bottom line here is, as far as Jaguar and Kim's conceptual argument is concerned, one can actually quite plausibly argue that the key principles, causal closure of the physical world and this causal exclusion principle, are less compelling if you think about causation in these difference-making terms rather than just in implementation terms. And as far as Libet is concerned, actually, even Libet himself sort of conceded that the neural readiness potential isn't quite a difference-making cause of the resulting action, because he recognized that a subject is still able to abort a consciously intended action even after the initial readiness potential was already in place. And speculated, if I remember correctly, that this is some form of free won't rather than free will. Of course, could discuss that further. Which is to say that the neural readiness potential most definitely is not the difference-making cause by itself, but it is at most an ingredient in a more complex mechanism. And so, therefore, these Libet experiments have not really invalidated the claim that if we look at explanations of human behavior in psychology and the social sciences, at least very often the difference-making causes of human actions are best attributed at the psychological, intentional, cognitive level, rather than the underlying physical level of the brain.
Mm-hmm. So, does your approach need any form of mind-brain dualism to be true for it to work?
It doesn't. So one very important feature of my theory of free will is that it is entirely compatible with what is called a physicalist worldview. So a worldview according to which there is a sense in which physical properties and physical processes are somehow fundamental, and everything else, as we say in philosophy, supervenes on those physical properties or physical processes. And so is somehow indirectly, albeit in a very complex way, produced by those. That basic assumption, also called supervenience physicalism, is one of the key hallmarks of a sort of mainstream scientific worldview, one that I think most of the scientifically motivated free will skeptics will definitely embrace. And for the purposes of my theory of free will, I can completely accept that underlying physicalist picture of the world. And the only, perhaps slight twist that I'll put on this, and that's also a well-established twist, is that I accept a form of what is called non-reductive physicalism. So you can accept that all higher-level phenomena in the world are products of underlying physical processes. They supervene on underlying physical properties, but they are not explanatorily reducible to underlying physical processes. That is to say, for many higher level phenomena, it may not be possible to give an adequate description or explanation of those phenomena in physical terms alone. And so a key insight behind this non-reductive physicalist approach is that supervenience does not imply reducibility. And so long as one accepts that, one can be a physicalist, completely reject this form of traditional Cartesian dualism, and yet accept my theory of free will.
Mm-hmm. But since your approach is a non-reductive one, does it imply that it's an emergentist one or not?
Well, that depends a lot on what we mean by emergence. So emergence is one of those very interesting but also contested terms, and there are many emergentist ideas and emergentist doctrines out there that are being debated by philosophers, scientists, and other thinkers. And broadly speaking, one can distinguish between those emergentist views that reject the supervenience idea and those emergentist views that accept the supervenience idea. And so if you are happy to call an emergentist view that still accepts supervenience physicalism, if you're happy to still call that a form of emergentism, then in that sense, my theory of free will is an emergentist theory of free will. But I just want to be careful to emphasize that this should not have the sort of Cartesian dualist connotations that somehow free will requires something kind of totally extra physical that comes on stream or is added to our ontology of the world without in any way supervening on underlying physical processes. So that kind of very strong emergentism I would not accept.
Mm-hmm. I understand. So when philosophers talk about free will, they are, I guess most of the time at least, referring to human beings. Can we say that other animals, other living beings might also have at least some degree of free will?
Yes, I think one can. And I think my theory of free will gives us a helpful framework for thinking about this question. As I explained earlier, I define free will as this three-part capacity consisting of intentional agency, choice between alternative possibilities, and causal control over the resulting actions. So that kind of nicely modularizes the idea of free will. And then in principle now, we can look at any organism, for instance, a non-human animal, and ask, does that organism possess some versions of these three capacities? Perhaps not exactly the same versions that we humans possess, but perhaps scaled down or modified versions of these capacities. I would argue that the answer to this question is yes. I mean, if you think about non-human primates, such as the great apes, to give an example. We know from primatology that chimpanzees, for instance, have remarkable cognitive capacities, and we learn more and more about the kinds of cognitive things that they can do. They engage in sophisticated decision making. They engage in sophisticated social interactions. Their cognition is undoubtedly a highly sophisticated one, albeit one that is in a number of relevant ways different from human cognition. I mean, for instance, they, as far as we know, they do not have recursive language, among other things. But arguably, our best biological theories of those primates would view those primates as agents of some sort with a sophisticated cognition. And that would seem to suggest then that a version of this capacity for agency is present in them. It's also very plausible to argue that as agents, those non-human animals face choices. In fact, there is actually a lot of work now in biology looking at choice making among non-human animals. Even I myself, in some joint work, have contributed a little bit to the literature on collective decisions in non-human animals. So choice making is a feature that is definitely present, not just among humans, but also among non-humans. And so in that sense, you could argue that the capacity for choice between alternative possibilities is also there in primates, let's say. And then, if our best theories also then attribute some form of mental causation to those primates, on the grounds that perhaps the implementation mechanisms for actions are, at least in some structural ways, somewhat similar to the human ones, then I don't see any barrier to also attributing causal control over the resulting actions to them. And that would then suggest that a form of free will, perhaps a somewhat more rudimentary form of free will, is also present in those non-human animals. So we really get a spectrum, because what we don't have exactly the same repertoire of agential capacities, but a somewhat different repertoire of agential capacities. But this is still recognizably a form of agency about which we can think through the lens of my theory. Still, there are important differences. So it would seem that the capacity for moral cognition or normative cognition of the human sort is not present in those non-human primates. And if we argue quite plausibly that the capacity for moral cognition is among the necessary conditions for fitness to be held responsible, we would then want to argue that responsibility, moral responsibility, is not something that those non-human animals can have, even though they can have some rudimentary form of free will.
Mm-hmm. So maybe they don't have moral responsibility, but could free will also play a role in the discussion surrounding animal rights and animal ethics? I mean, does it have any moral implications for how we should deal and treat other animals?
Well, it could. I mean, that it depends a little bit on what we think what we think the basis for moral status is. So, I mean, one argument suggests that whenever an entity or an organism is capable of perceiving pain, for instance, or has some form of sentience, that would then be sufficient to make that entity or organism an object of moral concern, so that we should then, care about that entity or organism. I mean, if this form of sentience or pain experience is sufficient for deeming an animal, for instance, an object of moral concern, then the issue of free will would be orthogonal to that. On the other hand, if we took the view that one of the ingredients that also play a role in determining whether something is an entity of moral concern, we think that one of the ingredients lies in their agential capacities, then free will might play a role there. But at any rate, what I would want to argue, because I mean wholeheartedly accept and endorse the idea that we should treat non-human animals much better than sadly, unfortunately, we do, and I think the more we learn about some of the remarkable capacities of non-human animals, the more, at the very least rhetorically, this should really reinforce the point that we must really we must really give much more moral respect to non-human animals than perhaps we conventionally do. So I think in the sort of repertoire of considerations that point out some features of the nature of non-human animals, it could be very useful to recognize that they are agents with some kind of proto-free will. Although I think even the point that non-human animals can experience pain should be already an important consideration that make us take their interests more seriously than sadly we often do.
Mm-hmm. Are there any instances where it would make sense for us to talk about free will, or at least discuss if free will exists in non-living entities?
So you have in mind artificial intelligence systems, for instance?
No, that would be my last question. Now I'm simply talking about natural non-living entities.
Natural non-living entities. Well, I mean, on my theory, intentional agency is one of the prerequisites for free will, and so the only entities that would be candidates for the ascription of free will are really candidates that qualify as intentional agents. Now, if we look at the natural world, the paradigm examples of intentional agents really are other organisms, so animals. I mean, there is a bit of a debate also in biology about the question of whether superorganisms, for instance, an insect hive, could themselves qualify as agents or proto-agents in their own right. Now, if you were prepared to attribute some form of agency or proto-agency to an insect hive, beehive, for instance, or an ant colony or something like that, then to the extent that you might view that superorganism system as an agent in its own right, you might begin to ask questions about whether that system overall could be viewed as having some form of proto free will. I mean, that's an interesting debate to have, but I mean, it's worth emphasizing also that while there are some analogies between superorganisms and conventional organisms. Those analogies, go so far and no further. And clearly, the extent to which an insect colony or hive is an agent is not quite the same as, for instance, a primate or a dog or some other such complex individual animal. And so if we look at our spectrum of possible cases of free will, those cases would be, if they are cases at all, they'd be decidedly further away from the human case.
Yeah. Okay, so my last question. What about robots and advanced artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so again, I think my theory of free will gives us a useful framework for thinking about the status of those systems. Here, as in the case of non-human animals, you can in principle ask, should we view a given robot or a given advanced AI system as an intentional agent in its own right? Should we view it as a choice maker that makes choices between alternative possibilities? And should we view it then as a system that has some form of causal control over its actions? I think all of these are reasonable questions. Indeed, the notion of agency that I defined at the beginning of our conversation when I talked about representations, motivations, and the capacity to act, or sometimes called belief desire, intention agency. That notion of agency is also quite influentially used in debates about artificial intelligence. And it's no surprise that a lot of AI research is actually framed as research into autonomous artificial systems. So, I mean, one of the key points that are being discussed there is whether an artificial system could qualify as an autonomous agent. Now, so I think we have every reason to think that a sufficiently advanced and complex system of that kind could qualify as an intentional agent, perhaps depending on the complexity and nature of the system, somewhat on a par with some non-human animal organisms, perhaps at this point still relatively simple organisms, because AI, while making advances, is not that advanced yet. If then our best explanatory theory were to view those systems also as choice makers that make choices between alternative possibilities, then we would have to say, well, the second capacity is also present in them, and if we were also prepared to then attribute causal control over the resulting actions to those systems, then we would have to reach the conclusion that those systems have, again, some form of proto free will. Now, I'm not at this point, entirely convinced that we have sufficiently strong AI systems right now that this kind of perspective is absolutely indispensable. So it might be that with relatively simple or basic AI systems, a more reductionistic perspective on those systems might still be defensible. But to the extent that this non-reductionistic agential perspective on AI systems becomes increasingly indispensable, and it could, we might indeed have to conclude that some form of free will is also present in those systems. And again, I would find that an interesting, but also not necessarily unhelpful conclusion, because already now there are big debates about how to design ethical AI systems. I mean, this is very, very important. I mean, the more we use AI systems in society, and the more those AI systems are also involved in making certain high stakes decisions, we'd want those AI systems to be designed in such a way as to adhere to ethical norms and make decisions that are in line with ethical principles. So systems that have at least some of the features of ethical decision makers might at the end of the day be more satisfactory from the perspective of making ethical decisions than systems that lack those features. But of course, there are many very complicated moral and societal questions about, for instance, what would be the resulting systems of responsibility attribution, which are hard to settle just in a sort of speculative way, and which are also definitely not settled by the theory of free will alone.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So before we go, are there any good places on the internet where people can find your work?
Well, people can go to my webpage. So if you just type my name, Christian List, into Google, hopefully you'll get the link to my webpage. And on my webpage, most of my research papers and research articles are actually freely available and downloadable as PDF files. And there are also some blog articles at the so-called Brains blog, titled The Naturalistic Case for Free Will, in which I gave a sort of relatively concise summary of some of the key ideas underlying my book on free will. So there are a number of such resources where people can access written versions of these arguments.
Okay, great. So I will include links to that in the description box of the interview, and also to your book, which was a great read, by the way. And Dr. List, I hope to have you again somewhere in the future on the show. So,
thank you, Ricardo. It's been a great pleasure. I really enjoyed being on your program.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with top academics and scholars from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you prefer PayPal, I also have links to that in the description box of the video. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please leave a like, share it, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litzke and Blanchett Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Henry Kalenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Yugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yassila Deza Araújo, Eden Solan, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, and Yannick Punter. My producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Godriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Vanegdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michal Ruzieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.